My name is Mara Webster, and it's my absolute pleasure right now to introduce the director, Marielle Heller.
Hi, guys.
I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about how they pitched the script to you, because you've talked about how you were less interested in directing something that was a straight biopic, which this film definitely isn't. So was that something that you were aware of when they sent you the script and you first read it?
Nobody really pitched me the script. I had met the writers, Noah and Micah, because we all worked on a TV show together a number of years ago. And when they explained the script to me, there was nobody said the word biopic. It was really, we're making a movie about Mr. Rogers. We've been writing it for many years. It's kind of surreal. It's got lots of elements of miniatures. They described it with such interest that immediately I thought it sounded very fascinating. And at the time, I had a 6-month-old baby. So I was thinking a lot about people like Mr. Rogers. And I said to them something really blatant, like, why am I not directing that movie? And they were like, oh, we don't know you. And then it was maybe 2 years later that, or maybe not quite that much, that Peter Seraph, the producer, sent me the script. And it just kind of landed in my inbox in the right day when I was ready to start reading things after I had made Can You Ever Forgive Me? And the script was just so moving. I read it not really thinking it was going to be something I was necessarily going to do. But by the end, I thought I had to make this movie.
And Tom Hanks had infamously already turned down the project, not just once, but 3 times. And then you came on board and managed to convince him within a week. What do you think the aspects of how you described it to him differently were that made him jump on board?
Well, I think Tom largely picks projects based on filmmakers because he's fans of filmmakers. So for him, knowing that there was somebody who had a vision behind the project, who saw it in a certain way, and yes, it not being a biopic was important to both Tom and I, and that I wasn't interested in him doing an impression of Mr. Rogers. We weren't going to do prosthetics or anything that totally made him look exactly like. I wasn't interested in that. I wasn't interested in him. I didn't want it to feel like an SNL sketch. I wanted it to feel like the essence of the person was right and that we got to be very close and intimate. It was really a character study for me. And he immediately was excited about that. And but I do think really the difference was he was a fan of my first film. We had kept in touch with each other over the years. And he is just the type of actor who believes in filmmakers in a really great way and loves collaboration. And there are people he wants to work with. So I think he really considered the project because we had been looking for something to work together on.
I'd love to talk a little bit about the pacing, because I think it's so interesting and it's not the natural way that we speak now, but Mr. Rogers had a very kind of slow affectation, wasn't afraid of silences, and you really pulled that in through Tom's performance. So how did you set about making sure that it worked and hit the right notes in that respect?
Well, I think movies kind of dictate what they need, right? And Fred really did have everyone would say when you would meet Mr. Rogers, time would slow down. That when you were talking to him, he altered time. And so the idea was that we wanted within the movie to have that experience of this guy who like lives in New York, is neurotic, has this certain way of being. He's really quippy and whatever. He's always doing 3 things at once. And then the moment he gets to Mr. Rogers, it's like time slows down and he doesn't even know what happened. And it was tricky to get the actors to slow down that much. I mean, particularly Tom, just because it's really unnatural. There's a lot of things about what we were asking from them for this movie that was pretty unnatural, even just not moving. Fred was so comfortable with stillness and so comfortable with silences. And you realize that we tend to fill silences, even if it's with movement or with little clearings of the throat or something. And I had to really almost slow his energy down of his whole body so that the stillness was really, truly still. And poignant and pregnant and was listening and was present. It couldn't just be devoid of other action. It had to be that very, very present silence. But it's only now that we've been doing press tours and we've done a lot of these kind of Q&As and Tom and Matthew have started talking about me in the public way that I've realized how tortured they were by the way that I guess I was making them do these scenes and how much I was slowing them down and kind of controlling the rhythms of these scenes. But I kind of approach things because I'm an actor and I come from theater. I kind of hear how the rhythm of a scene has to be and rehearse scenes with a certain rhythm in mind, and then want to make sure that so that I don't have to force the rhythm with the edit. I want to make sure we get the rhythm right in the scene on the day.
And when you were shooting all of the actual TV scenes in the neighborhood, it wasn't just a case that you were trying to recreate visually what it looked like. You actually researched and went and got the original cameras that they used to get. And I'm really interested in terms of why that was so important to you to begin with. And then also just the complexity of learning for you and your crew how to use an entirely different piece of camera work.
I mean, from an emotional standpoint, recreating the show, we needed to do it as authentically as possible so that it felt right. There's something about if you were a child of the 70s or 80s and you grew up watching a certain type of TV and you see footage from that era, it kind of makes your heart jump into your throat. You know, watching an old episode of Mr. Rogers, it just pulls you back nostalgically. We kind of got some pressure to not do it the original way, to not do it on the original tube cameras, but to try to digitally film it on an Alexa and then digitally change it so that it would look like that old footage, which we knew wasn't going to feel right. We tried to do it and everybody was like, this just doesn't feel right. We tried to get the original cameras they actually filmed the show on, because we filmed in the actual studio that they filmed The Neighborhood in Pittsburgh, WQED, in the actual studio where Fred filmed all of the program. And the original cameras, from what we could tell, had been donated to a high school in Pittsburgh, which had then been demolished, and the cameras were left inside and were demolished. So we couldn't get the physical exact cameras, but we got the same type of cameras. The only ones we could find were in England, and we had them brought over. And it was technically really tricky because we were essentially shooting, and it was PAL format for anybody who... so we were filming kind of what we called inside the show on those cameras. We were running live feeds so that we had live monitors, because it was really important to us that we tried to do everything as practically as possible. We figured if they could do it on the show, we should be able to do it. They were this like lo-fi public access television show practically. And they did their own green screen effects and things like that on that show. So we had that running, and then we had our Alexa cameras running, capturing that, it was multiple levels of the technology, and sometimes it broke down and was tricky, but for the most part those old cameras are workhorses and they held out.
And was it that same thought in terms of having that authenticity at every detail that led to the collaboration with Sesame Workshop to have them make the puppets as well?
I mean, that's the joy of making a movie like this, is that you get to find people who are just as geeked out about the details that you are. It's finding people who are just thrilled to jump into the details. And Spencer Lott, who is our lead puppeteer who works at Sesame Street, and his team of people, I mean, they were just so honored and excited to make these puppets and then to operate the puppets. We became very close with the Fred Rogers Company and all the people who worked on the original Neighborhood. So they kind of opened the vault for them, brought out the original puppets from under the glass, which they got to examine very carefully, and then they recreated them. I mean, so carefully that people who had worked on the show for 30 years went, "Oh, are you using our puppets?" And every time they did, it made Spencer like almost cry because he was so happy. And that kind of detail went into every aspect of it, the costumes, we hand knit Fred's sweaters because we had this beautiful access to his life and the people who loved him in Pittsburgh. His wife, Joanne, she invited us into her closet and said, I still have all these clothes of Fred's. Take them. I don't know what to do with them. So every tie Tom Hanks wears is a real Fred Rogers tie. And there's artwork on the wall that his sister painted for him. That's like a private joke of their families of 3 bananas. And, there were things like that it was about, for us, it was about feeling like we were honoring him in the right way. But it also felt like we kind of had the ghosts of Fred around us everywhere we went. But we really also wanted people who were die-hard fans of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood to watch this and feel like they were transported back, feel like they were really, truly seeing the neighborhood recreated perfectly. So that meant detail. That meant really, finding the original blueprints from 1968, building the set exactly as it was built. The couch, the upholstery for the couch had been discontinued 20 years ago, but we had to find the perfect fabric to cover that couch. It was like, that is the joy of doing something like this that's based on something real, that's beloved, is getting to get into all of those fun details.
And in terms of working on this project and looking at the way that he filmed his show and the way that he communicated with people, how did that inform the communication and atmosphere that you wanted to create on set for your cast and for your crew?
I mean, I think I hopefully always try to make my sets kind places. You know, I just am one of those people who really, I don't believe that you have to suffer to make good art. I just think that's a total fallacy. And I think a lot of my job as a director is to create a safe space where the actors feel like they can do deep work. And in order to do that, it has to not feel stressed or chaotic or unsafe. So that was always my goal. But then obviously making a movie based on Mr. Rogers felt like we all felt this shared responsibility to be sort of honoring his legacy. And we were in Pittsburgh, so everybody takes Mr. Rogers very seriously in Pittsburgh. And it meant that we tried to just be more humane with our movie making in general. We tried to make it a place where people were allowed to talk about their feelings. And I kind of had this mission going into this movie too of being more humane about making this movie because I have a little kid. And when I made Can You Ever Forgive Me, I would leave to go film in the morning and he would still be asleep, and I'd get home and he'd still be asleep. He'd be back asleep. And I realized I couldn't keep making movies that way. So we filmed majority of this movie, about 70% doing French hours, which meant 10-hour days, so that most people working on the movie could get home and see their kids. And for me, I just kept saying, listen, Mr. Rogers wouldn't want us to make a movie about him where we all abandoned our children to make it, which was a good argument that everybody sort of agreed with along the way, thankfully. So it kind of infused all the decision making throughout the making of the movie. And I think because of that, it felt like a very special project for all of us who worked on it.
And outside of the scenes where we're in the neighborhood, when we're following Lloyd, we're very much seeing the story and the film through his eyes and his experiences. So how did that inform the way that you thought about camera placement and camera movement for the majority of the film?
A lot of the movie, we thought about the sort of the two worlds, Fred's world, Lloyd's world. How can they look different but feel like they're of a piece, that they're of the same world? And that if we're switching between things like the miniatures and then going to New York City, how does it feel connected but feel like we're also showing the differences between the two? And that became part of it in terms of music and the way we filmed it. You know, we also didn't want the kind of lo-fi quality of the show to be so totally contrast with like a super, super high quality rest of the movies. So we shot that pretty low quality. For anyone who's nerdy about this stuff, but we shot it on the Alexa, but on their Super 16 mode, which is pretty lo-fi and uses less of the sensor, so that it had that kind of analog quality where it felt, it never felt like that drastic of a difference between the two worlds. And we talked a lot about how do the elements of Fred's world start to seep into Lloyd's world. Visual cues like zooms, which were an element, a camera move that they used a lot on the neighborhood, started to happen in Lloyd's world. And we started to use, we talked a lot about the ways in which these two worlds were separate, and then at some point they become mixed up with each other in terms of all of the language we're using.
And it's also really beautiful to watch the way that Matthew Rhys plays his character's cynicism slowly being chipped away. So how did the two of you work together and collaborate to make sure that at every point it was believable, the journey that he was going on emotionally?
I mean, so much of that is about getting at least a little bit rehearsal time where you can read the whole thing chronologically through and track it as an emotional arc, which is something I love to do and you don't always get to do, but I did luckily with this one. But it's just through a lot of wonderful, I love being in the dirt with actors and working through scenes and figuring out where we are on the emotional journey. And then together we can kind of be in charge of keeping track and making sure that we haven't gone too far one way or the other, that we're kind of following a bigger arc. But he's a very emotionally complex actor. He just is able to play so many things at the same time, which is part of what I loved about him and why I cast him in this. And he's so quick and so sharp, somebody you just always believe is the smartest person in every room.
I also wanted to ask you, kind of going back to when you were making Diary of a Teenage Girl and you went through the Sundance Labs as a writer and as a director, and that entire process, what are some of the things that you really took away or were really valuable from that experience that were coming into play and you were thinking about when you were directing this film?
I mean, directing and writing is just such a lifelong project, right? I mean, I feel like I'll be learning forever. What I felt like I came out of the Sundance Labs with such a clear sense of was my own voice and trusting my own voice. And so much of what happens when you're on set is that everything gets chaotic and there's so many people happening, there's with ideas, and there's so much stress, and everybody has the best intentions, but it starts to pull you away from whatever your initial intention and what you loved about the scene was. And so I just have this like trick I do from the Sundance Labs, which is for every scene that I'm going to direct, I write down in really simple bullet points what made me love the scene and what we have to get. If everything else fails, what do we have to get from this scene? What must we convey emotionally? And then I just try to connect back to my own self throughout the day. And I have all of these things I have to do, including being totally alone on set at my monitor without anybody else there, which sometimes hurts people's feelings. But I have to be able to be in touch with my own voice. And something I think sometimes as women directors, we tend to be a little more shy about asking for those things that we need. And Sundance really helped me be more vocal about those things that I just need as an artist.
And you also created a lot of intimacy in shooting some of the scenes with Tom where he was playing Mr. Rogers. What was the decision behind trying to have more of a closed set and really create that intimate environment on set for him as a performer?
I didn't intend to have any kind of a closed set because it's not, you tend to close a set when you're doing like nudity or like a scene where somebody has to cry really bad or something. But when we were shooting the opening scene of the movie, it was Tom's third day on set. And it was our first day in WQED, and it was the first day we were revealing our set, and there was just this feeling that there were all these extra people there, and everyone was like so excited to see what was going to happen. Like, how is Tom going to do this? And, oh, is it going to work? Is it going to work? And I showed up early and was on set and felt like there was just like a wall of eyes just staring both at me, and then it was going to be at Tom. And Tom is really charismatic. He's a real people pleaser. He's really kind to everyone in the room. He'll say hello to the person in the back. He'll shake everybody's hands. And what we needed from especially that opening scene was the opposite of that. We needed like total intimacy. And so, yeah, I had this moment that was not planned where I basically kicked everybody out of the set, even though everybody was there just so excited to see Tom Hanks be Mr. Rogers. And I said, I'm sorry, everybody has to leave because he can't do what he needs to do with this environment. And it really helped because he came in and we were able to say, just like Fred talked about, we're just going to do this for one kid on the other side of the camera. I want you to picture your granddaughter. And we're just going to do the scene for her. And we're going to do it a lot of times. And we're going to have fun. And I think we did 22 takes. And it had to all be in one take, and he was singing live. And it was just so much to ask from him. So yeah, it wasn't a planned thing to have a closed set, but it ended up being what we needed to do to really capture that performance.
That's amazing. We'd love to open up to you guys if anyone has any questions. Yes, right here in the striped shirt. If you say, I'll repeat it. A mic's coming to you.
Pure artistry. I mean, I just loved it so much. Given the obsession it sounds like you had with detail and authenticity, it's always a question when you're portraying real people and real events, what, if any, if the word is liberties, or what were there characters in the story that we saw who didn't really exist, or where did you take artistic license?
We took essentially everything about Fred. We didn't take artistic liberties with. Everything with Fred went through a really careful and rigorous process of making sure it felt real. Most lines or things he said were things we had heard direct accounts of, things he had said to people or things he had said to Tom Junot, who the character of Lloyd was based on. We also had hundreds of letters between the two of them, so we had a sense of the way they corresponded. It was with Lloyd's character that we took the most liberties. And that was sort of a choice made really early on, and Tom Junot was totally happy with it. If anything, he was like, I don't want a movie exactly of my life. There are a lot of details that are based on him, his relationship with his father. The timing of it all is not the way the timing happened. His father dying at the exact moment he was meeting Fred, him also having a new child at that exact moment. He had a daughter, but she was born later. And there were liberties taken for storytelling purposes, essentially. But Tom Junot has been on this press tour with us too a lot. And it's so interesting because he's like, when I read the script, I felt like it wasn't really totally me. I thought it was a good story, but it didn't feel like it was me. And he was like, but once I saw the movie, it felt like it is me. And there were so many weird sort of similarities that we just sort of found as we went through creating Matthew's character. And I was very clear with Matthew, we weren't doing an impression of this writer. We weren't trying to be Tom Junot. We were doing our own version. But it ended up somehow feeling emotionally true, even if it wasn't literally true.
Hi. I have a question. By the way, I want to thank you too for not ruining my childhood.
You're welcome.
Also, I have a question about the rehearsal process. If it was weeks in advance, on the day of, and also, sounds like a trivial question, but I noticed that both Tom and Matthew didn't go eye to eye on close-ups of the other scene partner's eyes. They just stayed locked. Is that something?
You mean they didn't switch
Yes.
eyes?
Is that something you talked about, or is that just happened to be their process?
That just happens to be their process. I feel like that's highly trained movie stars learn, or actors who've been doing TV for a long time learn not to switch eyes. For me, if I can, I love to rehearse before we start filming because I like to have a really relaxed period of time where we rehearse. For Diary, I got to do 2 weeks. For Can You Ever Forgive Me, I got to do 2 days. For this, I got to do a week. And it mostly was table work. Like I just like to, because I come from theater, I just like to sit with the script with the actors and read through each scene, read through the whole thing chronologically, get a sense of the bigger scope of it, and then have the time to sit and talk about a scene and go, it feels like there's not quite enough of a build here, or, oh, this reminds me of my childhood and this story that happened. And just have the time to have those conversations where you find people's emotional way in or what they're bumping against. And then I can do some rewriting after that based on if they have problems with something or if something feels weird coming out of their mouth. But more than anything, there's that period of time where you get to kind of talk through anything that's not flowing in the way you need it to and just rework it. We never get on our feet. It's never about like figuring out the blocking of the scene. It's much more about figuring out the bigger emotional beats and talking through where your character is, and just that stuff you don't get to do in movies. Like you don't get to have the luxury of saying, do you think I'm mad about this or I'm mad about that? And I think my mom did this when I was a little kid. You know, all the fun character work that in theater, you usually have 2 weeks where that's all you do. Like when you start rehearsals for a play, you sit for 2 weeks around a table and read through the play and talk about every scene. And it's the best. So even if I just get to do a day or two with each actor of that, I try to do that. Yeah.
That was amazing. I was really fascinated by the scene in the Chinese restaurant when they were talking about the people who loved you into existence. I can't remember the exact.
Loved you into being.
That's it. And I noticed, well, first of all, that the actual moment of silence was profound. And there was a moment, I believe, where Tom actually looked straight into the camera. And I was curious if that was created in the screenplay or if that evolved into that in the course of rehearsal or direction, or how that came to be.
That was the scene that I was the clearest about when I went into directing this movie. Well, first I'll say, everybody who's in that Chinese restaurant are people from Fred's life. So his wife, the real Mr. McFeely, the real Bill Eisler, Marty Eisler, the real Margie, his nephew, people who loved Fred into being are there in that restaurant. So that's a nice little thing to know. The way it was written in the script, just because we're asking, is that maybe his eyes flicker to the camera briefly. Something like that. And I had him hold the gaze of the camera, I think, for 20 seconds, maybe more. The whole minute of silence is a little more than a minute of silence. But it was just something I felt so clear about the moment I read the script the first time, which was, we have to go a step further with this scene. In his show, Mr. Rogers asked the audience to be active participants. He asked children to be active participants in his television show. He'd say, have you ever seen a fish? And he would wait for an answer. And so I knew this was the scene where we were going to ask the audience to become active participants in our story. And I really didn't know how nervous people were about it. I was just like, yeah, this is what we're doing. And he's going to look right in the camera and we're going to hold it for the whole time. And it was only later that Tom and Matthew have said to me, like, oh, I didn't think that was going to work. And Tom said, like, are you sure? Are you sure you don't want to get another version of this where I don't look in the camera? But I felt, I don't know. I felt very, very clear about it. And very clear that we need that moment in a movie. And Tom made a joke. He was like, we haven't had this much silence since Charlie Chaplin days. But it just felt so clear to me that, you know, this was a thing Fred did. He did it when he won the Daytime Emmy Award. He did 10 seconds. He asked them if he could do a minute, and they said no. So he did 10 seconds. But he apparently would do it at dinner parties sometimes. So it was such a signature move of his. It felt like we needed to really honor that. And it's one of my favorite scenes.
Yes, right over here.
Thank you. It's really a great film. I'm wondering what your relationship was editorially with the family of Mr. Rogers. Did they have any say in the film's content?
They did. I mean, in order to make a movie about Mr. Rogers, it took many, many years for first the writers and producers and then me to gain the trust of not only Fred Rogers' family, the estate, the people who've worked on the program for many years, the Fred Rogers Company, who are still keeping his legacy alive by the programming that they're making, like Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, which is the modern day incarnation of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So the movie took 10 years to make, in large part because the first many years were gaining the trust and understanding and having the script kind of run through all of them and making sure it felt real to all of them. I didn't hear this until one of these talkbacks too, but Peter Seraf, our producer, said that the first time he met Bill Eisler, who's portrayed in the movie, he was talking to him about the movie and he said, I'm happy to meet you. It's never going to happen, but I'll meet you. And so it really was not a foregone conclusion that we were going to be able to make this movie. Follow up? They didn't have say in the final cut. They read the script, and if they had any concerns about the script, we listened to them. We had a really close relationship with them, but it wasn't like they had kind of censorship rights. It was much more like a respect and friendship, and we wanted to make sure it felt real to them. And Joanne visited set a lot. The sons visited set. Like, it was a very open flow between us. And they trusted us. I mean, I feel so close with all of the people from the Fred Rogers Company, with Bill Eisler and Joanne Rogers. Like, I can't even explain. I feel like they think of me as like their daughter, and they're just proud of me and proud of the film in a way. It doesn't feel like there's any kind of a like, well, it shouldn't be like this. It's just not the relationship we've had over these many years. It's been incredibly sweet. And so we showed them the movie when it was essentially done. And they called me crying from the car afterwards, and there were no notes.
I wanted to finish by just asking a little bit about the final scene where we just watch Mr. Rogers playing the piano and gradually the studio's darkening, and why that felt like such a perfect end note, and also even just the decision of like, what's he going to be playing at each moment throughout that to take us out of the movie at the end.
That was something that was in the script from the moment I got it, which was him playing the low notes of the piano. And I was so in love with that as an ending of this movie, because it's something that's said so offhandedly in this scene, and you don't think at all that it will come back. And our goal with this movie was to make it clear that Fred was a human, that above all else, he was not a saint. He was not born with this like easy path in life. It was hard to make the choices he made. It was hard to be him. And in many ways that had an emotional load that you couldn't ignore. And the writers had this experience when they first started researching, where they would say like, man, everybody just dumps their troubles onto Fred. And they said to Joanne, did he talk to you about like all the people who would come to him and tell him all of their troubles? And she went, you know, I think he felt that was private. He didn't share that with me, but you should ask Bill. Maybe he talked to him about that. And then they went to Bill and they said, you know, Bill, did he ever unload to you about all of the people who were coming to him? He said, no, didn't talk to me. You should ask Joanne. And you just realized Fred held he held, like a priest, people's troubles. He was like this vessel for the pain of the world. And part of what I think our misconception about Fred that sort of bothers me sometimes when I see like a meme or something about him is that he was just happy-go-lucky on kindness at all. That wasn't who he was. He was honest, and he was not afraid of the dark parts of life, and he was willing to go there in a really, really a real way. He was challenging to the people around him because he asked for a level of honesty and intimacy that most people don't require from the people that they come into contact with. And so that last scene, I just felt like encapsulated so much of what made him truly human. And that was always the goal of the movie, was to show him as a human.
Well, you absolutely have. It's such a stunning movie. It's really beautifully made and directed. And thank you to all of you guys for coming out tonight as well.
Thank you for coming.